Hello everyone and welcome to the next video in the vocal analysis series. We are going to be looking at Tsukasa today, and I really hope this intro isn't going to be 10 minutes long this time, but no promises. We'll see where it goes. So in terms of the voice actors that we've talked about up until this point, Reo is kind of the first one that didn't really have a whole lot of roles prior to Ensemble Stars and has only really had a handful since, so I think that Tsukasa is probably his most well-known role. And he was also very young when Ensemble Stars started. I think he was maybe 20 or 21 when they were doing the initial recordings. So this was actually more interesting than I thought it would be going through it, because you can kind of see him developing as a vocalist as Tsukasa is developing as a character. So it ends up being really interesting to look at all of that combined. And normally at the beginning of these, at least for the last few I've tried to do a vocal comparison, I did find another singing role that he has. He is in Prepara, which admittedly is a franchise I know next to nothing about, but apparently they have one male idol unit that consists of 3 members, and he is one of them. So I went digging, I found a couple of songs to use as examples, so I'm going to play those now and then we're going to talk about it. So I think overall he sounds fairly similar to Tsukasa. That last one is a solo song, and I think in the one part he does go deeper than Tsukasa typically does, but in essence the voice that Reo is using for Tsukasa is pretty much his regular singing voice as far as I can tell, and listening to his speaking voice there are a lot of similarities there. And we're not going to be talking about Sword Voice today because he is not in Touken Ranbu, so if anyone is keeping track, this is the first voice actor that we've talked about so far that is not in both series. But because this is me and I'm going to find a way to relate it anyhow, the unit that Reo is in Prepara, one of the other voice actors in that unit is the voice actor of my favorite sword. So that's clue number 2 as to who my favorite sword boy is. I feel like if you look up the voice actor, it'll be very obvious at this point, but that's a story for a different video. So in terms of Tsukasa himself, I don't think it will come as much of a surprise to any of you to learn that he has quite a nasal tone. Or I guess the proper technical term is nasalized in this case, but I feel like more people just refer to it as a nasal tone and kind of drop the technicalities around it, so I wanted to mention that just in case anyone was wondering, but as I said, I don't believe it's really a put-on character voice. I think that is mostly just how his singing voice sounds. And out of all the characters that we've talked about so far, I would say that Tsukasa's tone is probably the most nasal that we've seen to this point. And there are admittedly some people out there that just don't like the way that nasal or nasalized tones sound when they're being used for singing, but that's mostly personal preference. There is nothing quote-unquote wrong about the way that Tsukasa sings. It just depends on whether you like the sound of his voice or not. And I will say that going through this, even just recording the songs, I think I definitely underrated his voice a lot. He has improved significantly from the beginning. And it's not that he was ever bad, but technically there are so many things that he's doing in the later songs that seem to be a lot more effortless than they were in the beginning. And we'll talk about that as we go through, but more than the others where I feel like I had a good understanding of their voices going in, actually isolating his vocals has really bumped up my opinion of his singing in general. So that's my little preamble for what to expect in this. In terms of Knights in general, I would say they are the most pure pop / boy bandy unit in OnStars, and I use the term boy band loosely obviously because Arashi is there, but just in the sense of their performance, the fan service, the synchronized dancing, and obviously now you could say there's a lot of K-pop influences in there too, but that's kind of Knights in a nutshell. And in the last video I talked a little bit about the mixing for Knights and at least why I feel the mixing for Knights tends to be off. I didn't go into it a lot because I wanted to talk about it more this time. But for me, as somebody who studied at least a little bit of editing and sound production and things like that, I mentioned in the Kanata video that the reason Ryusei Tai typically does not have a lot of mixing issues is because of Chiaki. And what I termed a low neutral core, which again isn't a technical term, but is something that I'm using to kind of help explain my points here. So in a unit like Ryusei Tai, even though they have a lot of characters with higher voices or higher vocal tones and character voices, it doesn't matter so much because Chiaki's voice is low enough and neutral enough that it can be used as a base to build everything off of, and it can be used to either push or pull back in order to make everyone else blend better together. NiGHTS does not have that. The lowest voice in NiGHTS is Izumi, but as we've talked about a little bit in some other videos, Izumi's tone is extremely aspirate, and an aspirate tone is one that has a lot of breath coming through. So it's kind of like the old story of building your castle on sand versus building it on rock. If it doesn't have a strong foundation, you can't expect to build things on top of it and not have it fall apart. So because Izumi's voice, even though it's low, does not really have a supportive tone, it can't be used as a base for the others. And the only other member of NiGHTS who has a tone that is anywhere close to neutral is Ritsu, and Ritsu's tone trends nasal, I would say, more than it does anything else. But there are two issues with Ritsu being the base. The first one is that just because of his character, his tone is generally higher, and it's very hard to build on a tone when you've got lower and higher ones that you're trying to mix with something that's in the middle. The second reason is that, again, because of Ritsu's character, his voice is supposed to be kind of soft and kind of sleepy, and it just can't be pushed hard enough in the mix to temper everyone else. So this is not the fault of any of the voice actors. This is how they have been told to use their voices for the characters that they're playing. And obviously, if Asashin was using, like, Samatoki voice, this would not be an issue, but he's using Leo voice, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. So that's issue number one from my perspective, is that there just is no one to be that strong base for all of their voices combined together. The second issue that I've noticed, particularly in their faster songs, because this doesn't happen so much in the ballads, which leads me to believe that this is something that the music producers are doing when they probably shouldn't be, but a lot of the time NiGHTS sing at full tilt all the time. And if you've ever been in musical theater, like in a chorus group or part of a choir, you will know that one of the things they tell you is that you're not singing at full volume because that many people singing at a loud volume is just not going to work. You have to pull back a little so the whole group together creates one effect where no one is really standing out. And a lot of the times, especially in the choruses of NiGHTS songs, it's like they're just blasting at full volume. And this is obviously something they have been told to do, because I don't think that actors with their experience, both vocally and some of them have had theater experience as well, would do that without being told, hey, this is what we'd like you to do. And a lot of times the choruses in NiGHTS songs are also pretty high up in terms of pitch, and for especially male singers to get their voices there, they just naturally have to push more air through, so I think that could be a factor of it too. But while obviously there's not a whole lot they can do in terms of the types of voices that they have at this point, there's still things they could do in terms of how they're telling them to sing and how they're putting that all together. And again, this doesn't happen in every NiGHTS song, but I think it happens enough that a lot of people have noticed and have commented on it. And I'm not saying I'm the authority on this or anything, but from my perspective, those are the two things that I've noticed the most. And it sounds like I'm being really harsh, but NiGHTS is actually my favorite unit in terms of the characters and their stories. At least it was back in the old era. Ever since music started, I think we can all agree the quality of the storytelling has been very inconsistent, and admittedly I haven't read every single story because a lot of them kind of make me mad with some of the characterization choices that they are going with, but I feel like in terms of a cohesive story for a lot of these characters, if you just look at their journey throughout the one exclamation point era, it is a wrapped up story, and it kind of feels like when music was announced they were trying to figure out what to do with some of these characters and have still never quite got there. That's my rant on the storytelling, but in a lot of ways, in my mind, the characters, as they have developed, are kind of how they were at the end of the first game. And I am happy to keep thinking about them that way because I feel like, for a lot of them, it was the best version of those characters that currently exists. Alright, once again, I think I've talked more than I intended to, so let's get into the actual songs. So there's actually not a whole lot in Voice of Sword. There's a couple of really short solos, there's a couple of really short duets. It's one of those songs that sometimes they'll do with these bigger groups where everyone is just kind of singing over each other and it's very hard to isolate any of the vocals. But one of the interesting things with Tsukasa that I noticed going through all of this is that in the beginning he typically sang with either Izumi or Arashi. And that actually makes a lot of sense from a vocal mixing perspective, because in the last video we talked about Kanata's voice and how naturally when voices get higher they tend to trend nasal. but because Kanata has this whispery tone to his voice, it's almost tempering the nasal part of it with more of an aspirate feeling. So having a vocalist like Tsukasa, who definitely has a nasal tone, and putting him with someone like Izumi, who has a far more aspirate tone, they actually kind of neutralize each other a little bit and they sound good singing together. And one of the things I'm noticing in these videos, especially for groups and characters that have more distinct voices, whether that be their natural voice or the character voice that they're using, at the beginning, in the very early songs, the producers were always kind of sticking together voices that technically should sound good. It was like the easiest way to put voices together, and they get a little more adventurous as time goes on. So in a lot of these early songs, you'll notice that the other members of Knights that Tsukasa is singing with tend to stay the same, and then eventually it starts branching out. One of the other things you'll notice as we go through this is that Ryo's control over his vibrato gets a lot more pronounced as time goes on. At the beginning, typically, whenever Tsukasa has to hold a note, you have that very quick, fast, tight vibrato, which to me never sounds completely natural, or at least it doesn't sound like the vibrato that would develop if you've been singing for a very long time or have had a lot of vocal training. It's very consistent and he does it on almost every held note, but that will change as we go through. And Checkmate Knights is a song that I've always liked a lot. I know some people say it's slow, but again, I don't necessarily think songs being slow is a bad thing, especially for this series because it actually lets you hear longer stretches for the solos that we can look a little bit deeper into. So through his solos in here, again, you can hear that very nasal tone, which gets more pronounced when he's hitting higher notes. The duets, again, are with Izumi. They're not really letting them branch out at this point. They know that those two voices should sound good together, so they're going to keep them together for now. Again, Silent Oath is kind of on the slower side, even though it's got that very poppy, dancey backbeat to it. And again, he's only singing with Izumi, so this is something that the music producers continued for at least the first couple of albums. His vibrato in this is essentially the same as it was in Checkmate Knights. It's still very, very quick. There is the one section where he goes up a little bit higher, and we've talked about before how technically if someone is belting, that means that they are pushing their chest voice higher than the natural break in their voice. Sometimes it's hard to tell because unless, I can hear someone sing the exact same note on a belt and in head voice, you can't really tell if it's supposed to be past their vocal break. But the interesting thing, at least in Silent Oath, is that a lot of the characters have this one particular melodic line. It goes high at the end, and they go, at the very least, if they're not belting, they're singing very loudly. And pushing that much air through in that way is typically the same kind of vocal technique as a belt would be. It just might not technically be a belt because of the pitch that the notes are on. But with Tsukasa, instead of getting louder, it actually kind of pulls back. It's like he's afraid to push it too far. And I do kind of get that impression with some of these early songs that a lot of what Tsukasa is singing, he's playing it very safe. Like maybe he could do more vocally, but whether that, again, was just because Ryo was pretty young and hadn't developed his voice fully yet, or whether that was a deliberate character choice because at the same time, Tsukasa was very young and at the time kind of coming into his own as a member of Knights. Regardless, there's nothing about it that sounds bad. It's just compared to some of the other voice actors who really push through those notes, he kind of pulls back on them instead. So now he's finally getting to sing with a couple of other characters. And admittedly, he does have a very tiny duet with Arashi in Voice of Sword, but it was like 4 words. So this is a much better example of how their voices blend together. But going in order, we'll talk about Ritsu first. And like I said, Ritsu probably has the most neutral voice of Knights, meaning that he should sound good with almost everyone else. And this might seem odd initially, but after Ritsu, Tsukasa is actually the member of Knights that blends the best with everyone. Because he is the only one that has that really sharp nasalized tone when he's singing. Leo, again, kind of has aspects of that because of how high Asashin is pushing his voice to get Leo's voice out, but also because Leo was supposed to sound quite young. There is, again, almost a breathier aspect to it that turns it into more of a mixed voice than you might initially think it would be. But it was obvious, at least at the beginning, they were afraid of putting him and Tsukasa together. And the only one we haven't talked about yet is Arashi, and Arashi is interesting because her voice changes so much throughout the series. In the beginning, she tended to sing a lot lower, like her and Izumi were kind of being that bass, even though technically that's not what they actually were. But as the series has progressed, and as Arashi has kind of grown into herself more and become more confident with showing off different sides of herself, her voice has gotten quite a bit higher in terms of where her bass tone lies. And Kidemu naturally has a bit of that aspirate tone to his voice, but when he's pushing it up higher to reflect those changes in Arashi's character, it becomes more aspirate because there's more breath coming through with it. So, like with Izumi, Tsukasa and Arashi should have no problems blending together, and I don't think they do, and as time goes on you'll see that Tsukasa does get to sing with her more often. That last note there was kind of the first time when he gets into what I would call an actual belt and actually gets louder into it, but it's so short that that's really all there is, because it's another section where they're all kind of singing over each other. But Article of Faith is the first time that he does get to sing with Leo, and there's no issues, because as we've talked about with Wataru in terms of strong character voices, because that is not his real voice, Egu can pull it back when he needs to. And it's the same thing with Asashin. He can kind of take out some of the more prominent Leo-isms when he's singing with other characters. So there's absolutely no reason why Tsukasa and Leo shouldn't sound good together, and typically they do sound good together. And as a little aside, if you have not watched the night concert of the second Starry Stage, so the story behind that one was that they did both of the concerts in the same day. There was an afternoon show and there was an evening show. And Daiking, Ritsu's voice actor, had a previous commitment in the evening, which meant that he couldn't go to the evening show. So the afternoon show, they just did kind of a normal night set. And in the evening, they did a couple of night songs, and then the other 4 characters all got to do kind of 2 or 3 minute long versions of their solos, which are really fun. I'd recommend watching that in any case. And the other thing that they do is they do a ballad version of Article of Faith, and it is beautiful. So if you ever have any questions about whether the members of Knights in general are good vocalists, this is the one thing I would recommend that you watch. And the fact that they're turning this, again, really dance pop song into a ballad, it works really well. The harmonies are incredible. I actually like the song a lot more after hearing that version of it, but I would definitely say go look it up. As always, the videos of these concerts are not really that hard to find, but I think it'll give you a new perspective on the song and on them as vocalists in general. So that's my little aside, but I think it's relevant here. Again, at the end, he's pushing a little more. I would say it's still not as much as the other members of Knights tend to do, but it feels like he's getting more confident in his voice. And again, I'm not sure if this is a Reo thing, if it's a Tsukasa thing, if it's both kind of coming together, which I'd like to think, because I feel like that does kind of make sense. That's kind of the only noteworthy thing here. This is really the first time that Knights has a song that's outside of either dance pop or ballads, because it feels like anytime in any of these games there's a song related to Phantom Thieves as a concept, it's always kind of got this jazzy swing feel to it. And I think their voices suit that well enough. He gets to sing longer duets with Arashi, and this is kind of the point where they start moving away from Tsukasa just singing with Izumi and starting to let him share the wealth a little more in terms of who he's doing his duets with. Again, the belting is starting to get a little bit stronger. You can hear that his vibrato is starting to develop a little more too. It's not quite so sharp and quick as it was before. He has some sustained notes where it ends up being longer or where there's very little vibrato altogether, which again just speaks to an increase in vocal technique overall. And the one thing that Tsukasa kind of starts doing here, and then throughout the double exclamation point era he does it a lot, and we'll talk about a little more there, is he starts adding this vocal cry to the end of certain words, especially when it's on a belt or on a really loud note, and then the word ends abruptly. And this is a very Izumi thing. So it didn't happen at any point prior to this, but again, he wasn't quite getting that loud at any point prior to this. But we have talked about vocal cry before, and vocal cry typically is used at the beginning of words or at the beginning of new notes as a way to essentially hide any imperfections in the voice that might be caused by going to those notes. Typically it's jumping up to a really high note or there being a significant shift in the vocal technique. And it's a way to kind of cover anything that might be happening underneath. Doing a vocal cry at the end of words or at the end of long notes is a lot more of a stylistic choice generally, and Izumi does it almost all the time. So this could be something that Reo just kind of developed on his own over the years, but my headcanon is that Tsukasa heard Izumi do it, decided to try it, and then starts doing it a lot. And you'll hear it a lot more, as I said, as we go into some of the newer songs that they've done, but this is kind of the first time where it starts coming out, where you can actually hear it in the recording. There's a couple of things to mention in Promised Swords. The first one being that while we have talked about how Tsukasa at this point seems to be more comfortable pushing his voice in terms of volume, this is really the first time we've heard him pulling it back. And especially in the verses of this song, he has this really sort of soft, sweet, it's almost whisper singing, but it's not quite the same sort of thing. And we really haven't heard him come down to that level before. So once again, I think it just speaks to him getting more comfortable with different styles of singing. Other than that, there's not a whole lot we haven't heard in this particular song. But the one thing I did want to talk about is that when this came out, and this was the anime ending for Nights, but one of the things that gets referenced from time to time with the voice actors is this group chat that all of the voice actors in Nights are a part of. And when they first got the music for this song, apparently Reo wrote the group chat and basically said, "This is really high, are we sure we're all good with this?" And the rest of them were all like, "Nah, it's fine, we can do it." So maybe that story has kind of led to my belief that he wasn't completely comfortable singing some of these songs initially, but Promised Swords does go fairly high in the chorus, and obviously with a project like this where you have songs where the high parts are unison parts, I don't really talk about them a lot, because song analysis would be a completely different video series. But it is worth noting, I talked about at the beginning how a lot of the choruses in Nights songs do tend to go fairly high note-wise, and I think that's something else that gets kind of overlooked because with Nights a lot of people once again talk about the mixing issues. But these are not easy songs to sing, and I'd say compared to other units they are probably more technically difficult and more difficult in terms of the actual range of notes that they require to be hit. So now we're into the music era, and Little Romance is a little bit of a slower one, but it's the first time we get to hear a lot of them go falsetto in their solos and in some of the duets. He has a duet with Arashi where they're both going falsetto at the same time, which again is not easy to do because falsetto, as we've talked about previously, going over the vocal break into head voice is one thing, going into what one might consider a true falsetto is a bit of a different technique, and a lot of the times that transition is not exactly clean, which is why some people will do kind of a vocal flip into it, or they'll slide into it, or do a vocal cry, or something just to cover up any sort of little pitch wobbles that can happen when trying to hit a really high note in falsetto. So getting two of them to do it at the same time is impressive all on its own, but then hearing Tsukasa's falsetto after that, his falsetto is remarkably clean. And I don't think I've ever listened to this song closely enough to pay attention to who's doing what at what time, But I think I was sitting there with my mouth open because I was not expecting that. And there really has been nothing he's done to this point that's telegraphed that he would be able to do it that well. So it's very impressive. And this was about the first time when I was recording the songs and I was listening to it and going, he has improved so much as a vocalist. And there's not a whole lot else in this song. This song really is a showcase of what Knights can do in that upper register. And they're all very good at it. And again, some people don't like falsetto just because they don't like the way it sounds, but technically there are no issues with it, and this is probably some of the cleanest falsetto we've heard in this series so far. And the other interesting thing is that when Tsukasa is going into falsetto, his voice almost completely loses that nasal quality. There's a couple of times where he sounds very much like Leo, and once again I am trusting the vocal divisions on the wiki as being right. You can still tell when he's singing out of falsetto that it's him, but that is another way to kind of distinguish between head voice and falsetto. Sometimes when it's difficult is that a lot of times falsetto will sound a lot more unison amongst singers just because of the techniques required to get there, whereas most singers, if they are particularly nasal or aspirate or mixed voice or whatever they happen to be, when they go into head voice, those qualities kind of stick around. Sometimes going into falsetto, it loses them entirely. I feel like out of all of the Knights songs, Mystic Fragrance is the one I hear about the most in terms of mixing issues, and yeah, this is the one I was referring to when I talked about how during the chorus they are literally all singing at full belt, and they probably don't need to be, because as a concept, I really like Mystic Fragrance, and there's so much about it that's good. This is not Arashi's video, but it is one of the few early 5-star feature unit songs that I think actually reflects the character that it's supposed to. I really like the instrumental. There are so many good things technically going on with the singing, it's just the mixing in the chorus I feel like makes people shy away from it a little bit, so let's talk about the rest of it. So this is one of those songs, again, where it feels like Tsukasa is getting a lot more comfortable with singing loudly. There's a couple of places where he has solos within the chorus part that I would say this is, if what he was doing before wasn't true belting, this is definitely true belting, because it is high enough that I would imagine it's over his vocal break, and he's pushing through it in chest voice in a way that he really hadn't previously, but most of the other members of Knights would. And there wasn't really an opportunity for it in Little Romance, but this is one of many times where he implements that Izumi-esque vocal cry at the end of some of his long notes. And this isn't necessarily the best song to talk about it in because he doesn't have a lot of sustained notes, but it will come up later, so this is me just saying again, pay attention to his vibrato and how it's changing, because you can already hear it even in these snippets, and especially when he's singing with other characters, and we'll talk about it more when it becomes more pronounced in some of the slower songs later. In this one, he's basically only singing with Leo in the duet part, so whatever fear the producers had of putting them together initially, they have obviously gotten over that. It sounds really good. He's still doing that vocal cry thing even when he's singing in the duets, and you can hear it when he's singing with other characters, and I know that's not Leo, so it has to be him. The other thing with this one is that Tsukasa actually does sing a lot. I think I had to cut a little bit of it for time, but one of the things I've noticed is that when he's singing lower, he's also starting to lose some of that really nasalized sound to his tone. There's still kind of a midpoint in his voice where it comes out more, but in the early songs it was basically happening all the time. And now his lower notes, I think I've mentioned before with like Eiichi and some of the other characters who trend nasal, that a lot of times to me nasal singing can sound very warm. And Tsukasa is getting to that point, especially in his lower notes. There's a very nice tone to them now. And that's something that, again, you really didn't see, in the songs that were recorded 9 or 10 years ago, but it's starting to progress that he's just having more control over his tone and how it sounds. And I think, again, that's just something that's come with time. So there's actually not a whole lot in this one, mainly because it's another one of those songs where a lot of the times they're either overlapping each other or there's a lot of trio singing. But for what there is, we get another example of how, at this point, he's really not afraid to push the volume when he's belting. And you can hear at the end of those really long, higher notes, there really is no vibrato to speak of, whereas at the beginning, he pretty much used that really quick vibrato on almost any note that was even a little bit sustained. And now he is completely eliminating it. So again, obvious progression in vocal technique there. A lot of his solo parts during the verses are kind of in that mid-tone where he still has, I would say, the most amount of nasalized tone coming through. But even then at this point, regardless of where he's singing, his tone is still very consistent. There isn't a whole lot in this one. I'd say the main thing to take away from it is that he is getting to sing lower more often now and just kind of getting to play around with the different parts of his voice a lot more than he was in the early songs. So even though most of the solos in here are very short, there's not really any duet parts or anything, he's still showcasing different aspects of his voice in a way that we really didn't see throughout the first couple of albums. Again, this one I had to cut quite a bit out of because he does sing a lot, so this is another example of one of the 5-star unit event songs that does actually reflect the character that the event was supposed to be about, but it was the last night's event of the first round of these, so I think most of the later ones, they kind of fixed the issues they had with some of the earlier ones not really feeling like a character feature at all. And I think overall Luminous Crown is a good example of a lot of the things we have talked about up to this point coming together. At the end, he gets this really nice part where the instrumental almost completely fades out so you can just hear his voice. He's in that really good kind of a low to middle part of his range that sounds very warm. There's a lot of control within his tone. There's a lot of minuscule push and pull with the dynamics where he's shifting how loud or soft he's singing within lines of music, which again is not very easy to do, and certainly wasn't something he was doing way back in the early songs. The other big thing to note, of course, is when he has his features at the end of the chorus where he is singing one really long sustained note and the rest of them are doing a different vocal part underneath. You can hear just how clean those notes are, and that is, at least in terms of Ensemble Stars music, a really long note to sustain. There's no vibrato, it's very steady, and once again he's doing the little vocal cry at the end, which does make a little more sense when it's a note like that, because it's basically you're pushing through the end of a really long note instead of trying to either fade it out or pull it back. So that would be the one time when I would say doing a vocal cry at the end of a long note is actually a technical thing as opposed to just being for style. But overall, I think this is a really good showcase of a lot of different parts of his voice that we've talked about up until this point. There's not a whole lot of vocal features in this one, so there's not a whole lot that's new to talk about. I think the biggest thing, again, in terms of vibrato that I wanted to mention is that in the early songs, whenever he had a faster song where there was some vibrato present, it was always that really quick, tight vibrato. In this one, even though the notes that he's holding aren't very long, the space between the vibrations is longer than it used to be, which, like I said before, to me always sounds more natural. So that takes care of all of the night songs. I feel like, once again, I've talked for longer than I probably should have, so I'm trying to make these last few a little bit quicker, but we'll move into everything else now. As always with these cross-unit songs, there is never really a whole lot of features for every individual character, but Tsukasa actually does get to sing with quite a number of people, 2 of which are still from his own unit, but but he does get to sing with 3 members of Ryusei Tai, albeit very briefly. Tetra and Shinobu are both, as time has gone on, it feels like the producers, instead of just putting together voices that on paper should work well, they're actually listening to how voices sound and being a little braver with putting similar voices with similar tones together. And that's kind of what's happening here. There are some similarities between all of their voices that I think at least merits the idea of trying to put them together, and I think for a song like this, it works. Again, it's very short snippets, but they sound fine. Chiaki is the first example where he's singing with someone with actually a significantly deeper voice that doesn't really trend either nasal or aspirate. Chiaki's voice is a lot more neutral than anyone in Nights for how deep his voice is. And they only have like 2 words together, so I think they would sound good together. It's hard to tell from that, but like I said, these songs, it's nice to hear at least a little bit of them singing with other characters, but it's hard to get the full picture of how 2 voices would sound together with how short these snippets are.
もう一度連れて行ってあの世界へあの世界を星に願うんだあの世界を
And once again, we have a song where they're singing with an entirely different unit, and he mostly sings with people from his own unit. So technically speaking, I probably didn't have to put Starlight Parade in here because he does sing with Eiichi in a different song later on and a lot more than just 3 words. But I like Starlight Parade, so I put it in here anyway. And his beginning solo, again, is another example of how much vocal control he has over his voice. It's once again a little bit softer, a little bit slower. There's very minimal background instrumentation happening. So even if it's not something entirely new, it's still just backing up some of the things we've already talked about.
君の声がかすれるまで欲のようなしばし嘘のように曖昧な言われても僕は願う愚かでも構わない抗うことを決めて
I talked about in the Ray video how much I like Endless Speed, despite it being a song that you really don't hear in the game because of the way the music video is structured. Looking at this group of vocalists, Tsukasa seems like he should be the outsider because all 4 of the rest of them have fairly deep voices, at least in terms of the characters that they're portraying. And this might be the lowest consistently that Tsukasa sings because he is singing with people that have deep voices. He's coming down to meet them. And one of the things I haven't talked about really at all in this series yet, because it gets into very technical things that I am certainly not trained enough to be able to differentiate a lot of the time, but one of the singing techniques that's possible is something called dropping or lowering your larynx. And this is something deliberate that can be done in order to create generally a deeper, warmer, more full tone. For the most part, within the Night songs, most of Night sing with a fairly high larynx. There's some people that debate whether or not Izumi in particular is dropping his larynx. I don't think he is. I think that's just how Masami-san's voice sounds generally. So I would say in general, all of Night sing mostly the same way. But in this song, I would say that Tsukasa is probably doing that intentionally because it sounds so different from anything else. And because his voice, which would normally stand out amongst all of these really deep singers, doesn't. So I won't go through all of them individually because they all kind of fall in the same range, even if their voices obviously aren't the same. But I think this is one of those songs that most people haven't listened to that closely, just because if you only play music, you don't get the chance to. I would recommend doing it just because it is a really good song, but also for Tsukasa in particular, it showcases such a different style of singing and a different part of his voice, and I think it's really interesting, and I'm glad that he was put into this group so that he was able to show that off.
夢に心地の時間愛を込めて迷い込んだ仕込む光と風失礼しました本日のスペシャルブレンド二人のブレンドハートを紫
So I'm really glad he got to sing with Shu in the last one since he doesn't here. He gets to sing with Koga and Tsumugi. The Tsumugi part, again, very, very short. The Koga one, significantly longer. And once again, you can hear how well his voice mixes with characters that have lower voices. But his bass tone here is kind of back to what it originally is. So especially comparing this one with the last one, you can hear the differences in how he's singing. And there's a very, very short line of talking in here. Again, like I said, I always like to get a talking line in if I can, just to get that baseline of how their normal voice sounds. Takasa's singing and speaking voices are very similar to each other, but apart from that, again, there's not a whole lot of really long solo parts, and it's mostly just his normal mid-tone that he's using.
嬉しいよ本当にドアとドアで通ってた登下校ファーストクラスのフライトとか普通じゃないっていう基準が違うだけ本当に誘ってセンターで記念撮影写真シールにする理由なんて聞かない声真似たのさ私がエスコートいたしますお手をどうぞお姉様
So this was a song that came out at like New Year's, which I feel like I didn't actually hear much about when it dropped, but it's really fun. It's all the Rich Boys, which I realized after actually looking at who was singing in it. And this is what I was talking about before when I said he had a song with Eiichi where they get to sing together more. And if you remember from the Eiichi video, Eiichi has a tone that trends nasal, especially when he's singing higher. So once again, putting two of the same tone together shouldn't be something to be afraid of. There are times when it doesn't work. Again, it's literally all down to the vibrations. But since Eiichi's tone is fairly neutral otherwise, it works with Tsukasa's, even if they both tend to trend nasal more often than not. And this song is actually really interesting because for a lot of the duets, what they've done is they've put a quote-unquote lower singer with a higher singer. And typically speaking, you would not think of Tsukasa as being the one to be a lower singer, Endless Vide aside, but he is. So when he's singing with both Tori, and Tori obviously it makes sense, because Ayu's voice for Tori is so high that almost anyone would be singing lower than him. But for Hiyori, I feel like that's not something a lot of people would expect, despite the fact that Na-chan is quite comfortable singing higher notes. But when I was looking at the vocal divisions, I don't think I'd actually listened to the entire song yet, and I was not expecting the Hiyori and Tsukasa duets to sound like that. So I think this is probably another example of Tsukasa lowering his larynx, because even his solo lines, even his speaking part sounds a lot lower than it typically does. So I find it really interesting that even at this point, the producers are finding new ways for these characters to use their voices, and to use their voices in ways that, you know, a few years ago you probably would have never considered.
足元にはまだ小さな強さで見出そういつでも寄り添えるすらつかないエスコートシュクラこの手で立てこんな自分になれるように
Okay, so listening to this after listening to the past few songs, you can really tell how much his voice has improved. Because I like With My Honesty a lot. I think he sounds perfectly fine in it. But you can tell that he's trending nasal the entire time, regardless of where his tone is sitting. Any of the really big, high notes that could typically be belted, he's still pulling back on. He's doing what he was doing when this solo came out during the era of the First Nights album. So it's really fascinating to listen to all of these in sequence and then have this one where you can just hear that he's just not quite confident yet with some of the things that he's doing with his voice. They still sound perfectly fine, he's just not giving as much as he is in the newer songs. And this is another one of those where I would say, like I talked about before, the night concert for the Second Starry Stage, he does this live. And this was another one where I think I actually like the song better after listening to it live, because when Reo's singing live, he typically does adopt a little bit of that deeper tone, and I think it suits the song, and it sounds really good. So if you haven't watched that concert, this again is my recommendation to go do that.
響いたリズムのワンステップあと一足を踏み出したいもうとどめたボリュームで星のシャンデリアに照らされたどうか踊っていただけませんかその瞬間に止まった世界は歌が溢れる
Really the only thing I wish that Shall We Dance had more of was just more chances for him to open up. Because at this point we know that he has no issue doing it, but because of the style of song it is, it's not nearly as ballad-like as With My Honesty. It's a little bit faster, it's got more of that dance background again. So there's not a whole lot of room for him to showcase the parts of his voice that weren't fully developed during the last solo. but even throughout the parts that are there, you can hear how warm his tone is. When he goes into louder notes, he's coming at them from underneath, so they inherently will sound warmer because of that as well, as opposed to hitting the notes head on. So even though, and I feel like I have this complaint about a lot of the second solos, even though I wish they showcased more of the vocal progression that has happened between, the first albums that came out in 2018 maybe, and these ones that came out in 2024. There's nothing wrong with the song, and even with what there is, you can still hear that progression. And that brings us to the end. This was so much more interesting than I thought it would be, and I talked so much more than I thought I would going into it. Because initially I was like, I don't think I have that much to say about Tsukasa. I was wrong. And like I said earlier, at least I'm pretty sure I said it, and I'm pretty sure I kept it in, that this was definitely the character where his vocal progression was the most obvious and where you can really hear it happening throughout the years. And I would say if you were like me and kind of discounted Tsukasa's voice or have this image of it that is like 2015 Tsukasa, please listen to some of his more recent songs and pay attention to his voice in particular, because I think you'll be impressed, because I certainly was. Alright, so coming up next, I had said I wanted to do at least a couple of the 4-member units, and then I will do Shu, because people still keep asking me to do Valkyrie. And as I've said, it's not that I don't want to do them, it's that I really want to do them, and I'm trying to hold off because there's only 2 members. But a lot of people have asked me for Tatsumi, so I'm going to do Tatsumi next. And I will admit, he's another one where I haven't really listened to his voice in particular, especially because there are a lot of members of Alkaloid that have, I would say, more immediately distinct voices, so I'm very interested to do that. After that, I might do either Subaru or Nazuna. I'm kind of going back and forth between them, but it'll be one of those, and then I'll do Shu, and then I'll do someone from the other 4-member units. And that's already the next few videos, so I think that's as far ahead as I want to plan at this point, but as always, if you enjoyed, please like, comment, do all of the things that the algorithm wants you to do, and I will see you next time.